Welcome to Awakening Mindfulness at Work, a conversation that matters. I'm Pierre
And I'm Sarah Killeen. We are bringing to you conversations and practices to cultivate presence, calm, and balance in the workplace.
Joining us today is Dr. Jonathan Fisher, cardiologist and author of Just One Heart. Thank you, Dr. Fisher, for joining us and for bringing a grounded and deeply human perspective to healing and well-being. And we're really looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you. I feel the same.
So the first question we had for you was, you describe wisdom as a kind of synergy between the brain, the heart, and the gut. Would love to zoom in on the gut aspect. So how should we understand that? How would you describe that? Is it intuition, bodily sensation, something else entirely? And how can we begin to recognize that and most importantly, trust it in our everyday life?
The conversation around wisdom is one that we don't engage in enough. And my bias is that if we practiced developing wisdom, we would have less conflict and we would find more equitable solutions to all the problems that we have. And we also would experience less stress. And the traditional thinking on wisdom is that if you ask someone, where does your wisdom originate? They'll point to their head, thinking that the brain and all of the thinking that we're aware of is the ultimate source of wisdom. And most of what we call the wisdom traditions go back thousands of years, whether we're talking about Mesoamerica or the Vedic traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity. They all knew something that we are coming around to again, which is that the source of wisdom ultimately is not only in the mind. That is to say, not only in the thoughts we generate in our brain, which can be a limited way to understand and perceive the world. A deeper wisdom comes from the body itself. And the shorthand view of thinking about wisdom from the body is to speak about the wisdom from the heart and wisdom from the gut. But of course, we have dozens of parts of our body. All of them are sending information, and some of that can be very useful when it comes to perceiving our world accurately before the brain itself helps us make wise decisions. And traditionally, we think about wisdom of the heart in terms of bringing elements of compassion and courage and even love into the decisions that we make rather than fear. And when we're talking about the wisdom of the gut, I'm speaking literally about the gut, not in some metaphorical way, trust your intuition, as Spider-Man would say, trust your spidey senses. While I have a spiritual practice, I don't believe in pure mysticism. In other words, things that have no basis or grounding in biological or physical facts. And so the gut itself has hundreds of millions of neurons, nerve cells, which are constantly in conversation with both the heart and the brain by way of the longest nerve in the body called the vagus nerve, the wandering nerve. And most of the signals from the gut are traveling to the brain. Now, the gut is not telling us what decisions to make, but it can tell us in a broad sense if something doesn't feel quite right. And many people call that your intuition. So if you see an incident where two people are talking and there may be conflict and one person is harming another, we can often feel it either in our heart, in our gut. Sometimes we feel it on the back of our neck. This is all what's called embodied wisdom, the wisdom of the body rather than, strictly speaking, the wisdom of the brain. And how can we develop it? Like all wisdom, with practice. The challenge with the wisdom of the gut and the wisdom of the heart is that our senses, which enter into the brain, are so biased in favor of the visual senses and the auditory senses that we often disregard the senses coming from within our own body, what's called visceroception, or that's awareness from our organs, or interoception, which is perception that comes from within. And so one of the strengths of mindfulness practice, meditative practice, all mind-body practices, is they force us. They create space where we can tune in to these signals which we've often ignored for hours or days, or sometimes even for a lifetime. And many people who begin these practices describe a deeper sense of awareness and the ability to make better decisions because of this new wisdom that's coming from the gut to the mind.
That's wonderful. Yeah, it's a whole different dimension that I don't think in general we're aware of it, and just being aware of it and starting to consider it as we grow and as we develop our mindfulness practices, that is so enriching. Yeah, yeah. And one question that follows up is that capability, can that help us be able to manage stress and avoid burnout? Is that gonna play a role in that?
Not only does wisdom help us manage stress for many reasons and by many mechanisms, I would go so far as to say that unless we develop wisdom specifically, we will always suffer from stress. Unless we develop wisdom specifically, we will never escape the heaviness and the burden that comes with stress, and sometimes even burnout. And there is no escaping from burnout without wisdom. Now, the wisdom is broad. There can be many decisions that we make around stress and burnout. Often the most simple, important decision is to separate ourselves from the stress that's happening. And in the modern workplace and modern healthcare environments, so much of the time, burnout is not because of an individual who's lacking wisdom. It may often be an individual who's so filled with compassion that they forget the wisdom of taking care of themselves, and even the wisdom of setting firm boundaries and saying no. Because the culture of medicine often encourages us to say yes, please, how can I help? And the systems that we work in have developed in ways to leverage that and sometimes take advantage of it, knowingly or unknowingly. So how is it that wisdom itself, developing wisdom, and we'll define it in a minute, how is it that having more wisdom, not less, helps us with stress? Well, wisdom, I would say, is the ability to take a broad perspective, both perspective in time and also perspective from multiple points of view, so that when we make our decisions, they can be informed by the broadest set of information. And how is it that wisdom reduces stress? Well, first of all, there is an element of wisdom that teaches us that stress is not what is happening. Stress is not what is happening to us. Stress, as most people understand it, or distress, is our reaction. It's an emotional reaction, often grounded in or triggered by thinking patterns based on previously developed beliefs. So when we have the wisdom to know that stress is not what's happening to us, but rather how we are responding to it, we then, instead of focusing on all of the forces around us, we begin to focus somewhat on our internal resources and reactions. So that's one powerful way that wisdom can often eliminate stress or the experience of distress even before it happens. The second, as I've alluded to, is if we're faced with a tough decision, we're not sure what to do, we tend to become anxious. We humans don't like uncertainty. That can activate our fight or flight nervous system. And there's a very important connection between our nervous system and our mind. between our heart and our mind, such that when we become activated, when we become nervous, there is a diversion of activity in our brain from the central prefrontal cortex, which is the most modern, thoughtful, executive function of our brain, towards a more primal, primitive, some people have called it the lizard portion of our brain. And there's a literal narrowing of our senses. There's a narrowing of our auditory perception. There's a narrowing of our visual field. And in addition, there's a narrowing of our brain's ability to take in data from the past and to accurately predict the future. So we end up making decisions based on a very narrow, often fear-based perception of the present moment. And we often make a decision that discounts our future, so that we find ourselves regretting the decisions we make, our future self, our wiser self. And then the third piece of wisdom goes deeper. And this really, for me, comes from, again, what's called the wisdom traditions. And this has to do with the wisdom of knowing that so much of our fear and our stress comes from our ego, our own sense of our own self-importance, which tends to become magnified. And we tend to forget our connectedness with others and with the world around us. And we often perceive ourselves as being alone or isolated. This is partly due to modernity and technology. And so there's a whole dimension of wisdom which helps us see that we are not, in fact, separate from others around us, even though we're encouraged maybe to compete with them and to judge them. There's an element of wisdom that reminds us that we are connected with all people, that your fate and the fate of the community is my fate and will determine my fate. And also that this concept of I, that I feel like I am a person walking around through the world, there's a wisdom that knows that that's constructed from a lifetime of perceptions and thoughts. And it's that very hardened sense of self and the I that continuously bumps up and becomes irritated by things in our world, stressed out. And by softening that I and recognizing that it is constructed, that is a wisdom that's common to many spiritual traditions. You can look at Buddhism, the concept of the non-self, or Hinduism, the concept of the Atman, or the individual, and the Brahman, which is the universal and the unity there. Any tradition we look at, there's a wisdom of a dissolution of the self, which is another path to reducing stress. There are many other ways that wisdom and developing wisdom helps us live with less stress.
Yeah, I really appreciated how you broadened the definition of wisdom to include so many of those dimensions, again, that we may not typically think about and think that it's all in the brain and we're all, thinking wisely. But there's so much more to it. And I think adding that compassion piece and thinking about the collective good that's out there, I think that's such a beautiful way to bring a new dimension to wisdom. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like the dots that you both connected from individual wisdom to collective wisdom as well, and link between individual but also organizational cultures and communities in general. Many questions to ask there, but we'll try to just come to maybe one more question. So you described wisdom as, or you mentioned wisdom as a pursuit. It is a practice, like any wisdom tradition. Really, it is a practice. You mentioned mindful journaling in the past, and you write about it as well, and as one way to develop wisdom, to develop that quality. Why is that so, and how does that work? Can you give a few more practical insights there around mindful journaling?
Yeah. So one of the many tools to develop wisdom is mindful journaling. And the overarching reason that mindful journaling is a valuable tool is that it's impossible to capture wisdom, to hold wisdom, and to process wisdom without recording it somehow. Now, certainly we can rely just on our brains to remember every bit of wisdom that we've ever had. But if you're anything like me, there's a limit to that. But there's a lot more that happens when we take a pen or a pencil and we write on a piece of paper. So when we're referring to mindful journaling, it can be done digitally. There is evidence showing that there are some extra benefits of taking a pen and pencil. There is a kinesthetic or a movement-related activation that happens by moving our hand that activates parts of our brain that creates additional connections that might not happen if we're just typing on a screen.
Mhm.
And so journaling is simply recording what's happening in our lives. What makes it mindful journaling is bringing intentional awareness to our own experiences as we're living our lives. So not, again, just what's happening to us, but our own internal life that informs how we're interacting with others in the environment. The research on journaling and mindful journaling is very strong, specifically in helping us manage stress and manage emotions. And when I say manage emotions, I'm referring to increasing our awareness of our emotional life from moment to moment, which is the basis of emotional intelligence and successful relationships and successful leadership. We cannot do any of that without a moment-to-moment awareness of what we are actually feeling, which then, by the power of empathy, helps us attune to other people's feelings as well.
Mhm.
So when we take a pen and a paper and we begin to write about, let's say, yesterday's experiences, difficult interactions with a colleague, a number of things happen. The first thing that happens is we create some distance between the experience and our identity. So no longer did she say something to me and I argued with her and I became angry. Now suddenly there is a distance in space and also in time that I can see the emotions written down on paper and I'm not activated in the same way. The brain centers of emotion become less active the moment we put words to them, we name them, and then further, the moment we place those experiences on a piece of paper. There's a literal distance now. So we're not as wrapped up, or in the language of psychology, we're no longer fused with our emotions. Our identity is no longer threatened as much. So that's the first benefit. The second one is that now that we have some distance from our emotions or from our thoughts, we can examine them in a less biased way, in a more clear thinking way. And we can take new perspectives on things that happen to us. We can reframe experiences, if you will. And then the third is what I was alluding to at the beginning, which is unless we write things down, we cannot get a clear sense of the patterns that are arising. And once we start to journal, whether it's a couple of times a day, once a day, a couple of times a week, we start to notice when the same themes and thoughts and behaviors and reactions come up in ourselves again and again and again. That raises a new awareness that we cannot get in any other way. And it's that recognizing our emotional patterns that have developed often over decades that is critically important if we want to change our behavior and change our life's outcomes.
You're collecting data as well. Yeah. Fascinating. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you for sharing all this.
Great. Yeah, so this is very insightful, and for those listeners who want to get the full picture, this is chapter 7 from Just One Heart, is all about wisdom and all the different practices that Dr. Fisher described today, and many more. So this is a way to get deeper into the conversation. And I have just one closing question, Dr. Fisher, for clinicians who are so busy and want to do some of these practices, like the journaling practice. How could they do it? Would they carry a little journal in their pocket, and then when they have a thought or a minute, they could jot down that difficult patient encounter? Or just any last comment related to clinicians and people in healthcare?
Whenever we start to offer practices to help people manage their stress or improve the quality of their life, we get to the tactical skills and the daily practices, and the same question always comes up, which is, how do I have time to do one more thing? Isn't this just adding one more thing to my plate? And I would suggest that unless we add a few more things to our plate, but things that really matter, we're going to continue to experience our workplace in exactly the same way we have before. Nothing will change unless we do the practices. You can read a book about mindfulness, you can read dozens of books on stress, and they can have next to no impact unless they're combined with practices. It's like reading a book about exercise and expecting your heart and your lungs and your muscles to get stronger. We all know that that's a silly idea. And so the first hurdle for busy practitioners, clinicians, is to realize that this takes work, and it takes commitment, and it takes an investment, and the rewards are tremendous. In terms of once we've passed that hurdle, how can we do this? I can tell you that in my own experience, it was a combination of using my device. So I had a journaling app that every day I would write about the highs and the lows and the insights and the memories and my plans for tomorrow. And I also have dozens of paper journals as well. And you can have one that you just, as you said, slip in your pocket and work on throughout the day.
Thank you. So, chapter 7, wisdom continues. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.